Welcome to the Prado Museum. We're here just a few minutes before opening to the public on the museum's social media programming with our weekly session in English, a project supported by our U.S. nonprofit, American Friends of the Prado Museum. And we thank all of our friends and the many, many amigos that support our two institutions that are here to support the Prado Museum. And today we are with a very special guest, Dr. Amanda Wunder. She's professor of history of Lehman College and a researcher and author of the book Spanish Fashion in the Age of Velázquez. And you've done a lot of really great research. And tell us a little bit about your subject.
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here today at the Prado in Madrid with you, Christina. And what we'd like to talk about is the tailor who dressed the queens who were painted by Velázquez. And this is a man named Mateo Aguado, who was the tailor to the queens for over 40 years, from 1630 until 1672. And
oh my goodness.
I thought we could start by looking at the first queen who hired Mateo Aguado, which is Isabel de Borbón.
And so he's exactly contemporary with Velázquez. They both worked 40 years for the crown in Spain, and they're very contemporary.
Exactly, they're working at the exact same time together. I didn't find any documentation that actually connects the two, although they had to have known each other in this world of the court. And basically, Velázquez and Mateo Aguado, the lesser known figure, were working together on the same project, which was to present the images of the queens of Spain to the rest of the world.
All right, and so this amazing fashion. Tell us, first of all, what is she wearing? What is the vocabulary for all of this 17th century, vestment?
Right, well, this is an extraordinary portrait, and this is quite unusual, this incredible dress with this really long train covering the horse. But what's fascinating is I went through the documents that Mateo Aguado wrote requesting payment for his work at the court, which lists everything that he made. And in addition to that, we also have documents from the silk merchants who supplied the tailor and the other artisans at the court with their materials. And from that, we learn that at least part of this outfit that the queen is wearing really did exist. And what we see here is you see these white sleeves and what looks like a white doublet, which was the upper body garment that a woman wore, covered with silver stars. In fact, what we have here is we have sleeves, but we also have what was basically just a chest covering worn under the dress, because this was incredibly expensive fabric, and so you didn't actually make an entire garment out of it. It was just like it's basically a false piece, it gives the impression that she's wearing a full doublet under that overdress. But in any case, what we know from these accounts is that this really did exist. There really was a star-spangled silk which was used to make these pieces for the queen. And in fact, we know that she wore them because at one point the little diamond bits fell off and they had to replace them.
And they're diamonds?
It's unclear from the records if they're actual diamonds or false diamonds. They call them diamantillos.
Okay, so what's amazing, and I've never really noticed this before, is that she's wearing a ruff that's very similar to the king's.
Yes.
In this case, this was very different from other portraits.
Right. Now, the women wore ruffs as well as men. For men, the ruffs were outlawed in 1623, but women kept wearing them up until the 1640s. And another really interesting detail about this portrait, I think, that we rarely notice is these decorations along the hem of this incredible skirt, which are called alamares. And these are decorations that originated in military dress. You see right here. And we know again from the records what these were actually made of. This is black glass and gold. And the tailor Mateo Aguado designed these alamares, which were then created in the embroiderer's workshop. And in fact, Aguado was paid to make designs of the alamares, to make drawings, and he was making all sorts of different kinds of inventive new decorations in the 1630s for the queen.
And then she has her initials here and the crown.
Yes, exactly. So we have the initials
Isabel
and the crown.
de Borbón.
Right, right.
And then yesterday you were telling me when we were talking about this that she was very active. She was more active or participative in what she was going to wear.
She was. The documents are fascinating. So we have lots of records of Isabel de Bourbon sending things back to the tailor that she didn't like. So, and you can read between the lines. He's kind of complaining a little bit. So, she sent back a dress because she didn't like the buttons, or she wanted a different colored lining, or I had to completely redo something because the queen decided that she wanted it to have sleeves or not sleeves. And so there was a lot of back and forth. In fact, one of my favorite little bits from the documents was at one point there were silk weavers at the court, which is interesting because we don't think of Madrid as a major silk weaving center, but they were weaving a spectacular blue and gold brocade, and the queen didn't like it, and so they stopped, but they used it to cover a pair of shoes. And what's so interesting about this detail is if you know anything about weaving, you can't cut something off a loom in progress. So that means the queen must have been visiting the workshop of the weavers the same way that Philip IV, the king, famously used to visit Velázquez to watch him paint. So we have Isabel de Bourbon very involved in the making of her wardrobe, the same way that the king was involved in the painting of these portraits that we have here.
Right. And so she's discovered all of this by studying the accounts,
right?
The accounting of the tailor.
Right. And so, and I should say these are the Royal Palace Archive here in Madrid, which has this incredible collection of documents. That's the source of all of this material.
Very good.
And now, after Isabel de Bourbon died in 1644, unexpectedly at a fairly young age, and this threw the tailor into a really bad financial situation because he and all the other artisans in her household were totally dependent on their primary patron. So when Isabel de Bourbon dies, suddenly Mateo Aguado is really struggling.
Right, because the tailor was for the queen.
Exactly,
not for the queen and the king. It was the queen.
Precisely. The king's and queen's households had their own teams of artisans. They basically had these parallel worlds in the two different households at the palace. But after Isabel's death, Mateo Aguado then, things pick up for him once Philip IV marries his niece, Maria of Austria, who comes to Spain from Austria. She's one of the Austrian Habsburgs. And this, in the 1650s then, with Mariana, turns into the most creative decade of the tailor's career, which of course overlaps with the most prolific decade of Velázquez's painting portraits of the women at the court. And so we have this incredible record of Aguado's work in these spectacular paintings like this.
Right. Okay, so what are the materials that she would be wearing here?
Okay, well, so the documents tell us a lot about what we're seeing. First of all, a dress like this took about 18 yards of fabric to make, which is about what it takes to upholster a sofa, okay? And so that's only what we can see with the exterior velvet. Underneath, there's all sorts of things going on. And so, for instance, we see this incredibly rigid bodice that she's wearing. Well, there's layers of different, like really stiff fabrics made of like canvas and buckram, things made of linen and wool, which are these very unglamorous fabrics which are under the surface, creating the structure.
So heavy,
right? It sounds really heavy. And then not only that's just in the dress, but then under the dress, of course, you're wearing a corset with whalebone ribbing. You've got this famous structure called the guardia infante, which was this enormous hoop skirt, which is giving her that incredible distinctive shape that we see. And between the guardia infante and the skirt we see, there's many more layers of underskirts. And one of my favorite details from the records is learning that these underskirts and undergarments were all pink or red, which were thought to be healthy colors. They're the colors of flesh and blood. And so the idea was that when they're worn close to the body, this is good for your health, specifically your reproductive health.
Right.
If you're a queen, of course, that is
what we're looking for.
That's your primary job, right? So you can just imagine when you see a portrait like this and you see these little red ribbons on her wrists, that's kind of signaling, oh, actually under the skirt, there were these flashes of red that you would have seen when she walked.
Wow, that is really fascinating because I've been studying a long time here, but never knew about the red and that ideas of the red being healthy for them. So that's great information.
Right. Now, there's wonderful details in the documents. There's still things to discover.
So much. So another reason, and we've added so much more information to seeing these portraits. Another reason to come to the Prado Museum to see these works of Velázquez painting the portraits of the Queen, but with the work of Mateo Aguado, which you have so much helped us to discover.
Thank you so much, Christina.
So thank you for being with us. You were here a few weeks ago in Spanish, and you came back to do the English session.
Come back whenever I can.
So thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, and we'll see you again next week.